With me is Margaret McSweeney, and we're so glad to have you as our guest today. And Margaret has written a book called Pearl Girls, and I like this sort of subtitle under here, Encountering Grit, Experiencing Grace. And at the top of the program, we actually tried to incorporate that word grit in there. And when you share about why it is that you why it is that you entitled this book Pearl Girls and where that pearl comes from, I'm sure you'll talk a little bit about the grit before the grace, right?
Yes.
So, Margaret, before we get into this, and this really is filled with some wonderful stories, challenges and victories. But before we get into it, I would love for you to talk about yourself and tell us who Margaret McSweeney is.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on the show, Barbara. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my heart and my faith. Margaret McSweeney. Well, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and with a family, just a wonderful family. My parents were so full of faith, and my dad always said, life should be an action verb, and he truly lived his life as a wonderful example to not only myself, but truly to so many people with his own personal testimony, which at age 30, he was diagnosed with a malignant cancer of the colon. And at that,
so young.
So young. And this was during the age, it was pre-1960, before chemo, before radiation. And he and my mother were at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. And that same weekend, they were about to publicly announce their decision to become foreign missionaries. And God just closed that door.
Wow.
And he didn't understand, but he always walked his life in faith. He called the head of the Foreign Mission Board and said, please pray for me. I'm not going to be able to become a foreign missionary. Please just pray for me. I have surgery tomorrow. And what had happened, the doctor had sat down with him and said, you need to go home, get your affairs in order, because most likely you will not be coming back from the hospital. And so that was, as a 30-year-old with two young sons at that point in his life, because I wasn't around yet, he went home, and he and my mom just got on their knees by the bed and just prayed. And here's the miracle of what happened, Barbara. He was in 8-hour surgery, very intense, but the doctors were just so amazed that the cancer, which the x-rays had shown had metastasized, had confined itself to one area.
Wow.
That was such a miracle. And then, he died, I guess it was about 32 years later, cancer-free.
So he lived another 32 years after
Yes.
having heard from the doctor that you better get your affairs in order because you probably aren't coming back.
Yes.
It's amazing that, the doctors can only see that glass half.
Yeah.
They can only see through a glass darkly,
Right.
but God had a completely different plan.
Yes, there is God. And there's a P.S. to the story. Weeks later, and it was a very difficult surgery and a very difficult recovery, but my father spoke with the head of the Foreign Mission Board. It was Dr. Baker James Coffin, I believe was his name. And it turned out that he had taken action in terms of when my dad said, please pray for me. There was a prayer chain of missionaries around the world, prayer warriors, as my dad shared with me, just throwing themselves at the throne of grace, and God intervened.
Yes.
And it's interesting because my dad had a book published as well with my song, I Will Praise Him, because he became an incredible musician, Christian musician, recorded 5 albums with Word, and then just months after his cancer surgery, performed with the London Concert Orchestra. Majestic themes, just beautiful, on par with Pavarotti, but with sharing the good news. And it's just so amazing, his his testimony that here there were prayer warriors, and so God answers prayers. And back to kind of who was Margaret McSweeney, I truly just walk in faith, and because I saw how my parents were examples in walking in faith, and I just faith God. My dad would always say, faith God on this. You have a question or direction, faith God. So
faith God?
Faith God.
That's what he would say?
Yes. I faith you, God. You know, that's how he lived his life. And that was...
I've never heard it said like that before. Faith God.
Faith God.
So faith was the action word, right? Wow.
Yes. Yes.
So that's awesome.
Yeah, so that was what I grew up with in terms of just having and seeing and experiencing firsthand this living faith in God. And so that was my example. And then I moved off to New York City and became a corporate banker off of Wall Street. And
what a contrast, Alabama and New York City.
That was a contrast. Yes, indeed. And it is interesting because I did not get my father's gift for music. I appreciate music, but please don't ever ask me to sing along anything.
Right.
But and he was so encouraging, and my mom too, in terms of corporate banking. Okay, you know, you go for it. God is leading you there, and use your gift. And so I went off to New York after getting a Master's of International Business degree and spending some time in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which was really fun. And lived and worked in New York City, there in Manhattan for 7 years, and met my husband there. And our first daughter was born in New York City. I took a cab to the hospital.
Okay, it was probably the better way to do it.
Exactly, exactly. We didn't have a car, you know, living there, and then a few months passed and realized, you know, I grew up in the South, and I just really wanted to end up in a suburban area, and my husband, who'd grown up in the Chicago area, was able to get a transfer. And so here, let's see, Melissa was 3 months old, and we just moved from our one-bedroom apartment in New York to the Chicago area, and I was a new mom and had left my job. And
so is this sort of like the balance between Alabama and New York?
I guess so.
I mean, I'm not sure I would say that, but I guess it, you know, it can be that sort of midpoint, right?
Yes, exactly.
Because it can be pretty crazy and busy here in the city as well.
It can.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you came to Chicago. You're in the suburban community of Chicago, and then what?
And then people always say that you will go back to what you love to do in third grade, and mine was writing. But somehow I had ended up on the New York corporate banking trail, and I think it holds true. And I always loved to write, and in fact, my third grade teacher, Miss Cook, said, "You know what? One day I think you're going to write." And yes.
See, I'm so curious about that statement because I have to really think, like, what was I doing in third grade, and what? Yeah. So I want to see how true that statement is. So you've sort of regressed back to third grade.
Yes. So.
Okay. But in a much more eloquent way and powerful way. So you're writing.
I started writing,
okay.
And God just started opening doors in terms of where I was supposed to be. I had a little neighborhood column in a newspaper, and then that opened up where I would meet other writers, and went to a wonderful Write to Publish conference, a writers' conference in Wheaton that's held every year for Christian writers. So I went there, and shortly after, my first book was published, and that began the path of writing.
Okay.
And meanwhile, a second daughter joined our family, so I was a busy mom and balancing all of this from home.
So can you write and change diapers at the same time? Or?
Not at the same time.
Not at the same
but
time.
You can still write in your head.
In your head, right.
Not with your hands. Not recommended.
So the book that we're actually referring to today is Pearl Girls.
Yes.
I enjoyed several of the stories that I read in here. But I'd like for you to talk about where does this title Pearl Girls come from?
Yes.
Share that with our audience.
Sure. It's the metaphor of the oyster who's going about its everyday life, and then all of a sudden a piece of sand gets caught inside its shell. And we as women will be going about our everyday lives when the unexpected grit catches us by surprise and gets stuck in our shell. But there is God. And God's nacre of love and grace covers that grit, covers that pain, and transforms the pain into a pearl and creates a community of pearl girls.
Okay.
Yes, and so together we unite and like a pearl necklace become precious for his kingdom.
So your objective in putting this book together, and then certainly want you to elaborate on the contents.
Yes. Basically connecting. I think so many women get stuck inside the shell and stuck inside the grit, and it's about reaching out, not only to reaching out to others in the community or friends, family, the church, but most importantly reaching out to God, because his grace can cover the pain and truly transform our lives. And God just kept putting these amazing women into my life, and the concept was there, just the metaphor. I didn't know what I was going to do with it or where God was going to lead, but I remember my dad would always say, faith God, walk in faith. And so I put everything in order, and I'll never forget Robin Jones-Gunn, who is featured here, wonderful, wonderful dear friend and Christian author of the Christy Miller series and Sister Chicks. She came up to me, and I didn't really know her. I met one of her friends who introduced us, and she said, you need to get this trademarked, Pearl Girls. So I walked in faith, got this trademarked, and thought, well, maybe we should put a book together. And I just reached out to women that I knew, such as Robin, and even met Bonnie St. John in a hotel elevator in Atlanta. Now Bonnie, and you'll read her excerpt here, she is just an amazing woman. She has one leg, lost her leg during childhood, and became incredible, a downhill ski racer, and won a silver medal in the 1984 Paralympics.
Wow.
And in fact, she's on a Starbucks coffee cup.
Yeah, somehow
Yes.
I actually recall that, I think.
Yes, yes. And we met during a conference in the elevator, and we bumped into each other like 3 times, 3 separate occasions. And she came up to me, she goes, okay, it's obvious that God wants us to meet. And because we purposely, within 12 hours, bumped into each other in a variety of places. And she said, sit down and share your story and let me know what you're working on. And so I shared with her about Pearl Girls, and she walked in faith and said, yes, I'll be glad to write a story.
Yeah.
And
Do you
share
think
that.
it's difficult for women to articulate the grit in their lives?
Yes, because so many of us want to have this facade of how's everything going? Oh, everything's fine, everything's okay, when there can be deep hurt. But I truly want to thank the women, and there are over 60 women who contributed their story and shared their grit and the grace. And it's so transparent and just so vulnerable. Because women have to put themselves in a vulnerable position to share the grit